All right, welcome everybody to the Yellowstone Conference. We're going to be talking about the role of adolescent faith and spirituality today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself as the moderator for the conference. My name is John Daly. I've worked as the Director of Spiritual Life here at the Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch. We're a residential treatment facility working with emotionally disturbed youth. I have the privilege today to get to work with this fine group of people. We're going to introduce Chris first. Chris is our one of our guest panelists. And Chris, would you just take a moment and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why this topic is important to you?
Sure. Besides having two adolescents of my own, been working in youth ministry for the last 25 years. The last 8 years at Intermountain, the children's home in Helena, Montana, and just coming out of 8 years in working in direct care in a very similar role to John in terms of the chaplaincy, and now in a role that involves training and teachings and settings such as this, and hoping to help faith communities understand the particular challenges and blessings that come with working with children that come from adversity or trauma or have some special challenges that get woven into their faith story. So thanks, John, for inviting me.
Thanks, Chris. And Eric?
Hi, good morning. My name is Eric Uriarty. I'm the resident student rabbi at Congregation Beth Aaron in Billings. We are the area's only synagogue for the over century strong Jewish community here. I think that we are one of the oldest continuously operating Jewish communities in Montana. I'm probably unlike a lot of people here. I don't have any children of my own, and because we're such a small community, there's not a whole lot of children that we necessarily work with within our own community. And yet I am very interested in being here today because I always jump at the chance to give sort of the Jewish perspective on a lot of our shared biblical literature and texts. And Judaism has a lot to say about upbringing of children and, the sorts of things that we emphasize to them, especially when they're going through difficult times, in order to carry them forward into adulthood and hopefully make them better people.
Great. Thanks, Eric. And Mike?
Hi, I'm Mike Shavers. I'm the CEO here at Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch. I've been here about 4 years. My early training was in ministry at Moody Bible Institute. And I've been working in both sectarian and non-sectarian organizations, providing services to kids for about the last 30 years. So I see my work and role as a calling, and this topic is is personal to me, as well as part of our organization's DNA and history. So it's great to be here and to have this opportunity to talk about the role of faith and spirituality in the treatment that we provide.
Great. And for those of you that are just joining us, you've landed on the panel for the role of adolescent faith and spirituality. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the core issues regarding independence, intimacy, and identity as they relate to spirituality with adolescents. The tricky part with adolescents is that they're in the process of figuring out who they are and identifying with a faith background or connecting with their own spirituality can be a challenge, as that identity isn't fully established at this stage. These youth tend to be a little more vulnerable to engaging in the exploration of the spiritual world and how their development or identity connects with those types of issues. And so we've assembled this panel together today to kind of talk about some of these issues. what I'd like to do now is start off with our panel by having you guys respond to this idea of what are some of the challenges that we're seeing today adolescents face with developing a healthy faith or spirituality. Is there someone that would like to start with some input? Mike, you want to kick us off?
I am willing to kick you guys off, although I'm really looking for Chris and Eric, who are more the experts in this. I'll tell you from a treatment provider perspective. At Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch and then facilities like ours, we primarily work with mental health issues and provide counseling and therapy. Research out there talks to us about how it really isn't about your approach so much or what your philosophical orientation is from a treatment perspective. It's about how good you are, how effective you are at instilling hope. And when we start talking about that idea of installation of hope, that's where the spiritual aspect comes in. And I think it is oftentimes in the mental health field world not recognized enough. And kids, everyone is looking for something to provide them a sense of hope and a way to see a path forward to a better life. And I think one of the roles of spirituality and one of the reasons it's so important in what we do is that that's the key message, whether, regardless of the faith that you practice, background you may come from, the key message of those faiths are hope, and we have an obligation to provide that for the youth that we work with. We have an obligation to help create a sense of identity that gives them a path toward growth and hope. So that'd be my quick response to that.
Chris or Eric?
So I'll go next. I think that the way that I've always learned and experienced and taught Judaism is that, it is a much more pragmatic approach to things than I think a lot of people really realize, even people in my own community. We tend to, look to the ideas of faith and spirituality perhaps in a little bit different way than, what could be considered to be more of a Christian paradigm. And by that I mean that, when we talk about faith or spirituality, we're really looking at the practical aspects of it, right? How does it guide you to do the right thing? How does it guide you to take responsibility for your actions? How does it provide a sense of comfort in the face of things that are overwhelming to you? How does it provide a sense of community when you are going through a difficult time that is beyond your individual ways of approaching it? And so, I usually teach people that, from my perspective, as a Jewish person and as a somebody aspiring to be a rabbi, it's less about what you believe and much more about what you do and how you engage in the world and the things that you can do and the things that you can't do. Right? It's like the Serenity Prayer. Give me the strength to change the things I can to. I usually say to persevere into the things that I can't and the wisdom to know the difference. So I modify it a little bit, but also to ask for help for the things that I can't change,
Yeah.
And I think if I were to weigh in on this, I think, the question about what are the challenges particular to adolescents, especially in our day and age, I think you think about adolescents that transition into adulthood from childhood. It's a period of questioning and belonging and trying to figure out and differentiate yourself from other authority figures in your life, whether that be parents or grandparents or the family system. what's your relationship going to be like in your peer system? The adolescents have a lot on their plate, even without the complications of spirituality, which is necessarily kind of messy. I mean, even if it's like my brother Eric points out, if the approach is pragmatic, I found in settings where I'm leading either as chaplain or a pastor, sometimes that's the most challenging aspect. Is that an adolescent is fighting two different things. One, they kind of want to know what the right answer is. Just tell me what the right answer is. I'm supposed to believe, what it is I'm supposed to do. But at the very same time, they're fighting this internal conflict of, okay, well, if you're the authority figure and you're telling me this is what I'm supposed to do I want to align with that? Or do I want to differentiate from that because I'm not sure exactly, whether I want to share the same faith system as my parents, or if I want to explore this. So I think the challenge both for adolescents and for those that are working with them is helping them balance those two dynamics: the desire for truth and something ascendant that's beyond them, and that they can align their life for greater purpose, while at the same time understanding the need to do that work internally and to drive it down to the point where it is going to guide their actions. It's going to give them a resource in time of trouble, that it is intensely practical, and that it will guide their steps, so that it's not just purely theoretical or head knowledge about here's the things I believe. So I think those are the unique challenges before adolescence, especially during this time.
I like how you each touched on something a little bit different, being that the challenges that kids or adolescents especially face is dealing with a myriad of issues in their lives, but leaning into hope, guidance, and connection to fill those gaps that kids might have. Doug Schroep writes about the 5 thresholds that kids tend to move through as they are placing their trust in a faith. And I wonder if maybe we could talk about how we can help kids that are dealing with some of these issues move through these different thresholds from distrust to trust through through maybe connection, or Chris, you even talked about family being an important function in the role of developing an adolescent's spirituality, and that they tend to adopt the spiritual practices or the faith backgrounds of their family, but then they're moving into this period of time into their adolescence, where now Eric, you talked a little bit about guidance, where they need to seek guidance for their life and find that next step toward their identity, but also kind of making this their own. And Mike, you talked about hope and how the kids look to spirituality to find hope, and I think part of that hope is also purpose. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about how do we support kids or adolescents that are in the midst of this process. Chris, would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I think unlike others on the panel, I'm sure, and those that are in the audience, though I can't see you and don't know who you are, have undergone some training and know about different stages of development in adolescence. John, you referred to the building of trust versus mistrust in the world. We talk a lot of times in a residential therapeutic setting about the absolute necessity to establish safety, both physical and kind of psychological and spiritual safety in the place, so that the greater work of relationship can be done. And as I think about my own training, I think about what I know about those stages. Once I got out into actual practice, whether it was teaching or preaching or chaplaincy, the thing that was most impressed upon me is that in learning about the stages, I thought they were a progression. You know, it made sense. You do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. But that we're all sort of working through all of those stages to some degree, and things can break down in development where maybe a certain stage has not been met securely. But I find even in my own personal experience that I have trust issues as an adult because I never really resolved certain trust issues in my family of origin. And so I resolved it enough to be a successful adult, but there's still dynamics that come into that. So how that relates to spiritual development, helping a child kind of navigate the world, I like what Eric brought up. I like what Mike brought up in terms of hope, and the practical aspect of our faith is that I think those of us that are working with adolescents, especially in a spiritual component, is that kind of old adage is that knowledge is best caught rather than taught. That adolescents are absolutely looking at what we embody, what they see enfleshed in us in terms of our faith system, much more than what we teach or the words that are coming out of our mouths. So how we can embody to them hope and a non-judgmental attitude that they're seeking and they're exploring and they're testing various boundaries, or if I'm going to be allowed in my family system to be something other than the faith system that I've been raised with, that as long as we come to that without too much judgment and preconception as to what the outcome should be, I have great faith in our adolescents and in their ability to resolve those issues as they see in us a sense of security and trust and hope embodied, rather than saying, well, here's what I know your parents want me to say, or here's what the dominant culture would say, but to join them in that journey of exploration and being permission giving in that, I think is a much more successful approach. And I'd be interested to see what the other panelists say in regard to that.
So one thing I was immediately thinking as you were talking about that was, I have learned more about how to study Torah from second graders than in some cases I've learned from my own professors in rabbinical school, which is in no way to downplay the absolute brilliance of my professors in rabbinical school. But I think, so I want to set that as a foundation because, Judaism is different than Christianity in a lot of ways. When we talk about faith, when we talk about spirituality, they're similar words, but they mean a little bit of a different thing. And conversely, when we talk about having the same beliefs as your parents, Judaism, I often teach to non-Jewish audiences, is really an ethno-religion, right? It is the religion of the Jewish people. So it's more than just, I'm an American, I'm an Italian, I'm a British person, I'm a French person, and I'm also a Catholic, Christian, Protestant, whatever you want to say. Because this is quite literally the faith of our direct ancestors in the community of our people. So with that in mind, it's like there is a much more flexibility within that system to allow for an opportunity for seeking and questioning and You know, in most mainstream American Jewish culture, it's almost a joke amongst rabbis that, you know, we see younger people at 3 times in their life: when they get bar bat mitzvahed, then when they get married, then when they have kids. We see them a whole heck of a lot more, not just because they want their kids to learn, but they want to relearn along with their kids, right? So what I think is that when you're talking about developing an identity of your religious identity, whether that's faith, spiritual, practical, pragmatic, personhood, whatever, it's always so essential, especially with younger kids, to emphasize it's okay to go back and forth between what you think you believe and what you think you know, and how you interact with the community, because we'll be here for you. We're not gonna throw you out unless you know, graffiti the side of the synagogue or the church or whatever, and even then, you know, we might talk about it. But it's so especially when I'm talking to kids that I'm tutoring and getting ready for bar and bat mitzvah, and for those that don't know, bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, mitzvah is a word that means commandment, and it's the things that we are supposed to follow out of the Bible. And then bar is son, bat is daughter. So literally at age 12 and a half to 13 and a half, you are becoming a son or a daughter of the commandments. But it's more than just saying, yes, I believe in this. In fact, there's not a single part of the entire process that I say, this is what you have to believe. I say, this is your legacy. This is a guidebook of how to act. Let's study part of it and tell me what you think about it. And I think that it's really interesting that what you brought up before about how, you know, adolescents, and I would almost say like pretty much everybody when talking to any kind of religious authority figure or whatever, they're vacillating between well, just tell me what to do, but I also am struggling over responding with what you want to hear. And I always emphasize to my kids when they're starting out with me at 11 or 12 or whatever, we're going to read a particular piece of text. I want you to tell me what you think I don't want to hear, but only if you actually if it's a question that you genuinely want to know the answer, or if it's a statement that you think it's a correct statement, because that's how we develop the trust in starting that educational process to building up their sense of responsibility for all of these things.
I love this conversation, and you know, again, from the type of kids that we work with at Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch, and in Intermountain others, we work with kids that come from backgrounds that they've experienced oftentimes trauma or dysfunction in their home, and that all gets intertwined with their faith and the practices that were there before. And this approach of exploring and coming alongside, I think, is so important for these kids. You know, so many times they've been exposed to, I had a mentor at one point that referred to it as assent theology, right? This is what you're going to believe. And they reject that. But as in our role to come alongside and explore and avoid this giving of answers, and having enough faith in our own beliefs that truth is truth, and truth has nothing to fear from being questioned, and to allow these young people to say, you know, let's judge how you find truth. Let's look at how you learn the scriptures or explore your faith, so that you find an answer that that you can call your own and become personal. And I think it's really important. I love the conversation we had before this panel, and Eric, we're talking about Torah study, and how it's almost the picture in my head is almost a debate of a true give and take. And I think that's really what we end up doing with a lot of these kids, and of saying, let's engage in this exploration of faith together, and let me help you figure out how you find the answers. And particularly when we're working with kids for 3 to 4 months, right? we're really just preparing these kids on being open to faith and spirituality. We're not going to be there for them long term, but how do we show them that that they can explore and that there is hope out there. There are opportunities for them. So,
Yeah. I've got a great question here that's asking a little bit about how do we approach someone or assist someone who may not have gone through the stages of development in order. They have, for example, if they in their life they had some challenges that they had to address to make them grow up sooner, for lack of better wording. Someone who has those gaps in their development, they're missing some pieces that they didn't receive either from their family environment or through trauma that they might have received. How would you respond to that?
So if I could jump in on this, so I don't have as much experience dealing with adolescents and children, but I do have, as one of my internships, I worked for a year in a drug and alcohol treatment facility. And a lot of times the people that I ran into who were already in adulthood were a lot of these people who were forced to, quote unquote, grow up early or skip major parts of their childhood development. And that was in part or in whole what led them to start to abuse a substance or get in trouble with the law or whatever. And the one thing that I realized and that I learned from a lot of these people, and I learned a lot from helping these people through some of the hardest times in their life, was that, if you find out where that shift happened, where it was, what part of their life they were forced to grow up in order to do, whether they came from a single parent household and they had to raise their younger kids or take care of themselves or whatever. Once you kind of identify that, or at least this was my practice, I would sort of deconstruct it. I would say, okay, let's look at the things that you weren't allowed to do and make mistakes on and discuss because it was literally like a life or death, or an eat or not eat, or a, have a roof over my head or not have a roof over my head situation. And let's really explore that in a space where you can talk about it and talk about what else you would have liked to do and the ways that you would have liked to explore things, and just give them the ability to say, in this particular space, whatever it is, you don't have to be all grown up. You don't have to give the right answer because it's not a life or death situation for you here right now. Mm-hmm. And building that kind of trust in a process that they never had the privilege of taking part in, I found to be incredibly helpful.
That's great. Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, I think my experience in working with youth that have experienced trauma, whether it has a specific religious or spiritual undertone, or was just something that kind of disrupted natural development, is that I like to balance that awareness of, all right, this will be an area that's, I hesitate even to use the word struggle, right? Sometimes we talk about this is going to be something you continue to struggle with, and there's some weight to that word that maybe sometimes doesn't open us up to the possibilities of how some of those things that we have endured also build into us a tremendous sense of resilience. And so I like to start from that place in working with children or youth or adults, is to say that those experiences that we have, good, bad, indifferent, traumatic, wonderful, everywhere in between, we have the ability then to learn from those experiences, understand ourselves a little bit better. I alluded to earlier, trust issues that I have from some of the not necessarily traumatic, but definitely adverse circumstances in early childhood in my family of origin. And so being aware of that, I almost I almost tell some of our kids, your awareness is almost your superpower, because most of the world is going about their daily life unaware of the internal issues that are within them that cause them to choose one path versus another. So once you become self-aware and you say, all right, I've had this interaction with a complete stranger, and it caused me to have this sort of visceral, reptilian brain sort of fight or flight response. But I know that, and I'm processing it right now, live and in the moment, and I have a choice. I can choose to either go down this path of just sort of letting my brain chemistry, letting my feelings, letting my emotions take me down the path of least resistance, or through the spirit, or through guidance from a higher power, or just through my own will and self-determination. I can choose to take another path, and to help children and teens and even adults understand how remarkable that ability is. That gives them an awareness, and then not only in that moment, but they then, if they can master that, or even not master, but even if they can begin to do that with some level of repetition and assurance that they can make a good choice even in a tough situation, that's a gift that they can give to others as well. I think that's a way of reframing some of that trauma or abuse or neglect or adversity as something other than just, well, this is the cross I bear, or this is the weight I'm going to have on my soul for the rest of my life. And to Mike's earlier point, gives them a channel and a pathway to hope, so that not only will things be different now, but they can continue to improve as I learn these skills.
These guys have way more experience in those areas than I do, and so I'm going to rest on their answer to that question, John.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that I think in your responses, there's hope for someone with those gaps, because there's those people willing to come alongside them in relationship and help them to gain that knowledge. I kind of want to switch tracks here, because there's quite a few people that have this question, and I think that it's important that we spend some time to address this. And that's, how do we help someone who's experienced religious trauma? And I'm assuming that we're all pretty familiar with that, what that might be. Whether it's rejection from a faith community, or has been hurt by maybe a religious establishment. But how would we go about helping someone that's experienced that go through that trauma and reconnect?
I'll jump in. Go ahead, Eric. Actually, I'd rather have you jump in.
Okay. No, I usually try and approach, just in general, religious trauma in two ways. One is to try to emphasize that any sort of religious trauma that they may have gone through does not make them a bad person, right? And I think that is entirely, that's really the core of it, especially when you're talking about a religious trauma that comes from, say, a rejection from a faith community or an ostracism or something like that, right? Like, you can be accountable for the things that led up to that, but it does not inherently make you a bad person. And then the second thing is really that, as definitely, and working with trauma is something that people pursue PhDs with that I have not done. So I'm by far and by no means an expert on it, but also to really emphasize that, as best you can, not to let those experiences define who you are, which also kind of goes back into the, it does not make you a bad person kind of a thing, right? Because I really find that when people go through specifically trauma that is connected to some kind of religion or faith or spirituality, that they then are almost forced to define themselves as somebody who rejected, in big quivering letters, faith, religion, or spirituality, as opposed to, no, there is literally a whole world out there of other things that may align with the reason that you had a problem before. And let's go searching for that.
Yeah, true.
I am trained as a therapist, although I'll say it was never a very good one. So I'll in that, when we talk about trauma specifically, whether it's religious trauma or other types of trauma, one of the key elements about what makes trauma traumatic or an event traumatic, it isn't about what happened. It's about the perception that the individual has of, how do I see myself in relation to the perpetrator? How does the community see myself in relationship to the perpetrator? And so if the perpetrator was one within the church, which happens, if the community sees them as good and looking and are looked up to, then who's bad? And it goes right back to that identity that Eric talked about. And I think, we need to be aware of those messages that start being repeated internally between victims of trauma, regardless of the type of trauma it is, and help them begin to sort those through. It goes back to your original question of identity, John, and, every type of abuse creates those questions for the kids that we work with. Again, did I deserve it? Right? Or am I the bad person? And they really need someone to walk alongside of them and help them start sorting out those questions and being able to identify, from a faith perspective, say, who are they in the eyes of God? Or who are they in the eyes from a faith perspective? And begin to assess that from some objective truth, not just kind of reacting to the trauma and abuse. And I think as both as clinicians and as spiritual leaders, that's one of our tasks, is to help people begin to see themselves through the lens of who they are in light of faith and spirituality and not in the events that have happened to them in the past. So that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, I think if the question is, how do we help those individuals that have been victims of trauma in a religious setting, then one of the kind of key components of trauma-informed ministry is just a self-awareness on the part of the religious community of what the effects of trauma and how what it can look like in terms of just anxiety or depression, and many other things. I don't want to oversimplify. Not all victims of a traumatic religious experience are going to present as a depressed or anxious individual. In fact, in a lot of cases, those that have experienced religious trauma become sort of exemplary religious members. They become perfectionists. They're the super volunteer, and so an awareness on the part of our faith communities to understand that trauma is experienced by individuals individualistically. It's not you can't figure it out. There's no shortcuts to relationship with anybody. but especially with someone who has experienced a form of religious trauma and then is brave enough and resilient enough to want to engage a religious community. So if we think about the other traumas and the sort of natural empathy and compassion we extend to those that lose a son or a daughter, or are a survivor of suicide, or any other number of traumatic life experiences, there are things that, because they are more common or more are closer to our personal experience, we might lead with a natural compassion that if we are somebody as part of the religious community, especially in leadership, and then someone comes to us with a trauma that was at the hands of somebody in a similar role to us, it can leave us feeling really uncomfortable and unsure of the way that we engage. So I would say that's where it is incumbent on us to lead with empathy and humility and understand that they're not primarily coming to us for answers in terms of why did this happen, or how could God let this happen. Those are questions that are naturally going to occur. They're looking for relationship, and they're looking for somebody to embody for them the unconditional love of God that's going to be with them and was not shown to them by whoever was the perpetrator of that violence against them. And so it's a willingness as a leader in a faith community to continue to enter that uncomfortable place of not having all the answers, but still walking with somebody through that trauma. And I can't think of any there's no pithy answer. There's no 5 steps to healing a traumatic religious experience. It doesn't exist. And if you see that book on the shelf of your Christian bookstore, do them a favor, pick it up, take it to the register, and say, get rid of this, because that's not how we heal as human beings. It's almost always and exclusively through the repair that's done in a relationship that helps to build hope and correct some of those negative experiences.
Yeah, I think, each of us wants to foster the value of forgiveness and redemption and connection. Returning to a faith community, and I think that Chris, you talked about this when you were mentioning the creating safe spaces for people to be able to experience healing. There's a question here that kind of addresses this idea of safe spaces, and one of the questions that was written is how do we provide youth with a greater opportunity to express their sense of faith and spirituality in maybe like a public school, or in addressing youth culture? How would you begin to connect with kids, knowing that there's some ethics involved and there's some boundaries around what can be shared and what can't be shared, and how we would go about doing that, and protecting that safe space?
Well, I have some experience in this as a youth and family pastor in the past, and in one particular setting, the church that I was serving was right across the street from the middle school and high school in a town of about 5,000 people. And so the youth group that I served was, one of 3 significant youth ministries in town. We were kind of where the mainline Protestants congregated, and then there was a Catholic youth group, and then there was kind of a Pentecostal fellowship that met. And those were the three main groups that youth could find to sort of belong. So what happens? What happens when you don't fit one of those groups? Or what happens when you're a member of one of those groups and you have a good friend in your English class or your math class, or is on your football team or your basketball team that you care about, and you're part of a group that says, hey, if that person wants to be saved, or if that person wants to be in right relationship with God, they need to believe what you believe. So that's the struggle, isn't it? Because each faith system kind of has some convictions about what are the right thoughts and what are the right, what's the right embodiment of a follower of God. And so, again, there's balance, because I don't think as leaders in various faith traditions that you want to shy away from the convictions of whatever particular system you're a part of. That would be foolish. I've had some people that coached me as a chaplain, for instance, in a residential setting, to want to put forward to families that are coming in to say, well, we really all believe the same thing, whether it's a Jewish kid or a Christian kid or a Muslim kid or a none of the above kid. And I said, no, that's ridiculous. We don't let, and Eric had pointed out at another point, that there are distinctions in what we believe and how we live it out. So how do we coach adolescents to faithfully walk their walk and their convictions, but to be respectful towards others that do not share those same convictions? And I think I've mentioned this word before, in our leadership in our faith settings need to lead with humility. And I think that's always the best place to start is, though we view things differently, what can I learn from this individual? And to see my relationship with that person as being the foundation for our interaction, rather than whatever response I'm hoping to seek from them, whether that's conversion or assent to my particular political or religious views, whatever it is we feel convicted about, that we want to share is and if we lead with that, we say, well, this is what I believe, or this is what's important to me. That's how it affects my actions and my interactions with you. I think that's always a much better approach than to say, that the expression of faith in the public square, especially in our public schools, that needs to take some sort of shape of gathering together others that view things the same way I do, and then seeking to influence those outside the group. I think if you start with that point of humility and acceptance, then that goes a long ways towards building bridges rather than building walls.
So it's a little difficult for me to answer this question, partially because the perspective that I'm coming from, I think, is very different from my colleagues in this room and probably many of the people listening in. Just in the sense that, I often give these figures out when I'm talking about, the Jewish perspective or whatever, but, there are 6 million Jews in the United States. There are probably less than, if I was to guess, 2,500 Jews in the entire state of Montana. So whenever I'm having the discussion of, how do you live your faith or your spirituality or your religion in the public square, it's usually a sense of, from the Jewish perspective, it being used against us in a lot of ways. I mean, just as an example, we're in the middle of the biggest holidays of the year, and because they don't neatly align up with the secular calendar, I am having to call not only, educators, but writing letters to adults with jobs saying, this is a Jewish holiday. It would be really great if you give this person the day off without it eating into their vacation or unexcused absences or whatever, because you wouldn't question somebody wanting to take Christmas off, right? It's interesting because, again, that sort of the scenario that you just put forth of, I strongly believe that if you want to be saved, you have to believe what I believe is completely the opposite of the tradition that I come from, right? Because Judaism is essentially a closed faith tradition that doesn't say we are the direct line to heaven or we are the direct line to God. This is just what our people do. And so even in that, we don't have the same sense of, oh, you're different, so you need to align yourself with us. For us, it's just, we just want you to accept us as being human in our differences too. And we're not trying to change your mind of what you do. We are just trying to hopefully get you to change your mind to see that we are different, and that's okay too. And so I think that it's ultimately like that the approach with humility aspect, I think, is very, very profound, but different people by necessity need to approach it from different directions. And I think understanding the nuances, because I agree with you, saying that Jews and Christians and Muslims are all the same at the core is so incredibly reductive, and it doesn't give an amount of respect to how the differences make us who we are and how they can increase our ability to have diversity and enjoy that diversity and come up with a new and better ways to work together, embracing that diversity. Because when you're reductive and you say, oh, we're all the same, then you automatically assume that, oh, that must mean that they're just like me, which is not the case.
Yeah. So, Eric, I wonder if I could challenge you on a follow-up question to this one, which is, how do we begin to take Judaism and make it a part of the youth culture? How do we connect with that generation and bring this discussion out to have more of a conversation about that?
I mean, I think that the best way that I would recommend is to, look at kind of to go off of what I just said, like look at what those differences are as being things to embrace, not the differences themselves, but the fact that we are all different and that's okay, right? The fact that we don't have to perfectly align ourselves with belief or the category that we fall under. It's not that we're all the same, but it's that our differences do not place us in a position of rivals or enemies, or, for me to say, so if I was to call up a school administrator and say, look, you have a student who's a member of our community, we have some incredibly important holidays coming up, we would really appreciate if you would give them an excused absence for that. Sometimes when I try to point out the differences, people take that as being that I am saying that they are wrong for not having the same belief that I do, or not having the same culture that I do. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that, we as a minority religion that then, led in some way to Christianity and Islam, which combined make up, I want to say, over almost half of the population of the United States, versus the 16 million Jews that exist in the world today, that should show you that we're not all the same. Yeah. But that you need to, it's okay to find out about what those differences are. And in a way, sometimes knowing what the differences are helps to solidify your own strength and identity in your own sense of belief structure or religion or spirituality, not by excluding somebody, but by saying, oh, this person believes something different. I believe this, but having interacted with them and seeing what the differences are, I'm now stronger in the belief that I have, because I know that this works for me. We Jewish people, by necessity, go through the world saying that everybody else is different from us and that's okay. And so I would challenge then people who are in the numerical and the cultural majority faith of the United States of America, which is Christianity, to say there are different people than me, and that's okay. That's what makes us so great in America.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you guys, I wish we could continue this conversation, but we've only allotted a certain amount of time to talk, and we've reached our allotment. So I don't know about you, but for me, this hour has gone by fairly quickly. We had one last question that was submitted, and this question has to do with how do we connect a kid that we're working with to a mentor in their community when our therapeutic relationship comes to an end. And I think what I'd kind of like to summarize this is to just come up with a one short statement of how would you like caregivers in our community to interact with you when we share the same clients. How do we go about reaching out to you as a member of the faith community to further the treatment and find that connection for that individual? If you had one final statement to give for that, what would you say?
Well, having been in a role similar to yours, John, I think the most effective way of doing that was to not wait till discharge, or not wait till a child is out of our care to begin that relationship. I would usually coach the parents or the family, grandparents, foster parents, whoever it was that we were working with directly, is that a lot of that will have to be led and initiated by them because of certain privacy laws and rules, but which complicate things. And then of course, COVID-19 is, taking those complications and taking them to the nth degree. But there are ways of connecting people with someone in a building and establishing a level of trust, even prior to discharge. That I would say, if you have a child that's in care, or you have a child that's in therapy with somebody who's not a spiritual therapist, that's not the purpose of that therapy. Would be to work with those individuals that you're presently working with, saying this would be a desire of mine, a mentorship or some sort of bridge to my faith community. Can we bring that individual in now and start to have the dialogue that would then carry forward?
Okay. Eric or Mike, you have a quick closing comment?
I would absolutely agree. And, I would say the same thing as I do when I'm advocating just general therapy to people. Don't wait for when you're in crisis. Wait, try it if you perceive a crisis coming up. And in this case, a crisis is, if you have a finite amount of time that you as a therapist are meeting with an individual and you need follow-on mentorship, halfway through, like when you see that and sort of the fundamental personality and what the values of the person are, that's the time to reach out. Because I've been engaged for things like this at the very last minute, and I say, I'm sorry, I really wish that I could help, but I simply don't have the time, I don't have the resources right now. But if somebody midway through the process, or even in the last 3/4 of the process, reaches out and says, hey, it's coming to an end on this date, I would really like to connect to somebody, here's the reasons why, then that gives it time to not only make the schedule work, but learn enough about the individual with their existing therapist to really make sure that it's the right fit and that you can absolutely help them.
Excellent. Thank you.
And some of this goes back to, I'll echo what Chris and Eric both said, but also go back to what we talked about earlier. First, if we want to connect them with a spiritual mentor past their stay in YBGR, then first we need to create that interest in them and nurture that. And then, as both Chris and Eric said, then be proactive in doing that while they're still with us. To say, how do we build these relationships? How do we begin to transfer that comfort you have asking me a question and exploring alongside. How do we begin to transfer that comfort to someone else in your community or in the community you're going to where you can maintain that relationship? And I think, we've seen that, whether it's through Young Life or different communities, Eric, your communities, to do some Torah school out here and other things. We've seen partners willing if we ask and if we engage. And I think that's really the important step is asking and engaging, and like Eric said, not waiting until the last minute.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate this conversation so much. And to all of you that have attended, we hope that this has been a benefit to you and that you've been able to learn or gain from our discussion today. Thanks for being a part of this, everyone. Have a great day.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
God bless.
Thank you so much.